The paradox of work. Work generally takes up a third of the time available for living. Work is a strange experience. It provides some of the most intense and satisfying moments. It gives a sense of pride and identity, yet it is something most of us are glad to avoid. On the one hand, recent surveys report that 84% of American men and 77% of women say they would continue to work even if they inherited enough money so they no longer needed a job. On the other hand, according to several ESM studies, when people are signaled at work, they endorse the item, "I wish I was doing something else," more than at any other time of the day. Another example of this contradictory attitude is a book in which two eminent German social scientists, using the same survey results, developed opposite arguments. One claimed, among other things, that German workers disliked work, and those who disliked it more were happier overall. The second responded that workers only dislike work because they are brainwashed by the media, on ideological grounds, and those who like their work lead richer lives. The point is that there was reasonable evidence for both conclusions. Because work is so important in terms of the amount of time it takes and the intensity of effects it produces in consciousness, it is essential to face up to its ambiguities if one wishes to improve the quality of life. A first step in that direction is to briefly review how work activities evolved in history and the contradictory values that were attributed to it, which still now affect our attitudes and experiences. Work as we know it now is a very recent historical development. It didn't exist before the great agricultural revolutions that made intensive farming possible about 12,000 years ago. During the previous millions of years of human evolution, each man and woman provided for self and kin. But there was no such thing as working for someone else. For hunter-gatherers, work was seamlessly integrated with the rest of life. In the classical Western civilizations of Greece and Rome, philosophers reflected the public opinion about work, which was that it should be avoided at all costs. Idleness was considered a virtue. According to Aristotle, only a man who did not have to work could be happy. Roman philosophers agreed that wage labor is sordid and unworthy of a free man. Craft labor is sordid, and so is the business of retailing. The ideal was to conquer or buy productive land, and then hire a staff of stewards to supervise its cultivation by slaves or indentured serfs. In imperial Rome, about 20% of the male adult population did not have to work. By having attained a life of idleness, they believed that they had reached excellence in their lives. In Republican times, there was some substance to this belief. Members of the ruling class volunteered their time to fill military and administrative duties to help the community and gave room for personal potential to expand. But after centuries of ease, the idle classes withdrew from public life and used their free time to consume luxury and entertainment instead. Work, for the majority of people, started to change radically in Europe about 500 years ago. It took another quantum jump 200 years ago, and still continues to change at a rapid rate right now. Until the 13th century, almost all energy for work depended on human or animal muscle. Only a few primitive engines, such as water mills, helped to alleviate the burden. Then, slowly, windmills with a variety of gears began to take over the chore of grinding grains, hauling water, blasting furnaces where metals were forged. The development of steam engines, and later electricity, further revolutionized the way we transform energy and make a living. An offshoot of these technological breakthroughs has been that work, instead of being seen as simply a physical effort that an ox or a horse could do better, began to be seen as a skilled activity, a manifestation of human ingenuity and creativity. By Calvin's time, it made sense to take the work ethic seriously. And it's for this reason also that Karl Marx would later reverse the classical evaluation of labor and claim that only through productive activity can we realize our human potential. His position did not contradict the spirit of Aristotle's opposite claim that only leisure made men free. It is just that, by the 19th century, work seemed to offer more creative options than idleness did. During the decades of affluence following World War II, most jobs in America might have been boring and bland, but on the whole they provided decent conditions and reasonable security. There was much talk about a new era in which work would be abolished, or at least transformed into purely white-collar supervisory tasks that would take only a few hours a week to accomplish. It didn't take long to see how utopian these forecasts have been. The global competition that allowed the underpaid populations of Asia and South America to compete in the labor market is again giving work in the United States a grim reputation. Increasingly, as the social safety net is in danger of unraveling, people have to work more often in arbitrary conditions and without much security about the future. So even now, at the close of the 20th century, the deep ambiguity of work still haunts us. We know it's one of the most important elements of our lives, yet while we do it, we would rather not be doing it. How do we learn these conflicting attitudes toward work? And how do young people these days learn the skills and discipline required to do adult productive work? These questions are by no means trivial. With each generation, work becomes an increasingly fuzzy concept, and it becomes harder for young people to know what jobs will be waiting for them when they grow up, and to learn how to prepare for them. In the past, and to a certain extent even now, in hunting or fishing societies in Alaska or Melanesia, we can still see what the pattern used to be everywhere else in the world. Children, from an early age, participated in their parents' work, and gradually found themselves performing as productive adults without missing a beat along the way. An Inuit boy was given a toy bow at age 2, and he started practicing shooting right away. By 4, he might be expected to shoot a ptarmigan, at 6, a rabbit, and from there he graduated to caribou and seal. His sister went through a similar progression, helping the women of her kin group to cure hides, cook, sew, and care for younger siblings. There was no question about what one should do when one grew up. There were no options to choose from. There was only a single path to productive adulthood. When the agricultural revolution made cities possible about 10,000 years ago, specialized jobs started to appear, and a degree of choice opened up for young people. Still, most of them ended up doing what their parents did, which until a few centuries ago was mainly farming. It was not until the 16th and 17th centuries that a large number of young people began to move from farms to cities, to try their luck in the burgeoning urban economy. According to some estimates, by age 12, as many as 80% of country girls in some parts of Europe left their farmer parents, whereas boys left on the average 2 years later. Most of the jobs waiting in London or Paris were in what now would be called the service industries, as charwomen, coachmen, porters, or laundresses. The situation is very different now. In a recent study, we asked a few thousand representative American teenagers what jobs they expected to have when they grew up. What the results show is that adolescents have unrealistically high expectations of becoming professionals. 15% of them expect to become either doctors or lawyers, which is almost 15 times higher than the actual proportion of doctors and lawyers in the labor force, according to the 1990 census. Most of the 244 adolescents who expect to become professional athletes will also be disappointed, since they overestimate their chances by about 500-fold. Minority children from the inner city look forward to professional careers at the same rate as affluent suburban children, despite the fact that the unemployment rate for young African Americans in some cities has been near 50%. The lack of realism about future career options is in part due to the rapidly changing nature of adult jobs, but it's also caused by many young people's isolation from meaningful job opportunities and adult working models. Contrary to what one might expect, affluent teenagers actually work more often in high school than poorer students, even though they don't have to. And exposure to productive tasks in home, the neighborhood, and the community is much greater for children who grow up in wealthy and stable environments. There, one can actually find 15-year-olds who plan to become architects and who have learned to draft in a relative's architectural firm, who have helped design an extension to a neighbor's house, who have interned with a local construction company, although overall such opportunities are infrequent. In an inner-city high school, the most popular informal career counselor was a school guard who helped sharp young boys find jobs with the gangs and directed good-looking girls toward so-called modeling jobs. According to the ESM results, it seems that young people learn their elders' ambivalence toward work quite early. By age 10 or 11, they have internalized a pattern that is typical of society at large. When they are asked to say whether what they are doing is more like work, or more like play, or like both or neither, sixth graders almost invariably say that academic classes in school are work, and doing sports is play. The interesting thing is that whenever adolescents are doing something they label as work, they typically say that what they do is important for their future, requires high concentration, and induces high self-esteem. Yet they are also less happy and motivated than average when what they do is like work. On the other hand, when they are doing something they label as play, they see it as having low importance and requiring little concentration, but they are happy and motivated. In other words, the split between work that is necessary but unpleasant and pleasant but useless play is well established by late childhood. It does get even more pronounced as adolescents go through high school. When the same adolescents eventually start working, they report exactly the same pattern of experience from their workplace. In the US, almost 9 out of 10 teenagers are employed sometime during high school, a much higher proportion than in other technologically advanced countries like Germany or Japan, where there are fewer opportunities for part-time work, and where parents prefer their children to spend as much time as possible studying, rather than being distracted by jobs irrelevant to their future careers. In our study, 57% of 10th graders and 86% of 12th graders have held paying jobs, usually serving fast food, as clerks or salespersons, or as babysitters. When teenagers are paged on their jobs, they report very elevated self-esteem. They see what they do as important and requiring great concentration, but they are less happy than usual, although not as unhappy as in school, and they don't enjoy themselves. In other words, the pattern of ambivalence is set by the very first steps of their working lives. But work is definitely not the worst thing adolescents experience. The worst condition they report is when what they do is neither like work nor like play. When this is the case, usually in maintenance activities, passive leisure, or socializing, their self-esteem is lowest. What they do has no importance, and their happiness and motivation are also below average. Yet for adolescents, neither work nor play takes up, on average, 35% of the day. Some, especially children whose parents have little education, feel that half or more of what they do is of this kind. A person who grows up experiencing most of the day as neither important nor enjoyable is unlikely to find much meaning in the future. The attitudes set in the early years continue to color how we experience work during the rest of our lives. On the job, people tend to use their mind and body to its fullest, and consequently feel that what they do is important and feel good about themselves while doing it. Yet, their motivation is worse than when they are at home, and so is the quality of their moods. Despite huge differences in salary, prestige, and freedom, managers tend to feel only somewhat more creative and active on the job, while clerical and assembly line workers are no more unhappy and dissatisfied. Men and women, however, tend to experience work outside the home in different ways. Traditionally, men's identity and self-respect have been based on the ability to obtain energy from the environment for their own and their family's use. Whether the satisfaction a man gets from doing a necessary job is partly genetically programmed or is entirely learned from the culture, the fact is that more or less everywhere, a man who is not a provider is to some extent a misfit. Women's self-esteem, on the other hand, has traditionally been based on their ability to create a physical and emotional environment suitable for the rearing of children and the comfort of grown-ups. No matter how enlightened we have become in terms of trying to avoid these gender stereotypes, they are far from gone. Teenage boys still wish to become police officers, firefighters, and engineers, while girls look forward to becoming homemakers, nurses, and teachers, although girls nowadays also expect to become professionals, such as doctors and lawyers, at a rate that is even higher than for boys. Because of the different role of paid work in the psychic economy of men and women, the response of the two genders to their jobs is generally different. Leaving aside those still relatively few career women whose primary identification is with their jobs, most women who work at clerical, service, and even managerial occupations tend to think of their outside job as something they want to do rather than something they have to do. Work is more voluntary for many women. It is more like play, something that they could take or leave. Many of them feel that whatever happens on the job is not that important, and thus, paradoxically, they can enjoy it more. Even if things go wrong and they are laid off, it will not hurt their self-esteem. As opposed to men, their self-image depends more heavily on what happens to their families. Having a destitute parent or a child who has trouble in school is a much greater load on their minds than whatever can happen at work. As a result, and especially in comparison with the work they have to do around the house, women generally experience employment more positively than men. For instance, in an ESM study conducted with couples where both partners worked, Reed Larson found that women reported relatively more positive emotions than men when doing clerical work, computer work, sales, meetings, working on the phone, reading work-related material, and so on. The only job-related activity women experienced less positively than men was when they worked at home on projects brought back from the office. No doubt because, in those situations, they felt responsible also for the household tasks, in addition to those related to the job. The double jeopardy that a family and a career imposes can be a heavy burden on the self-esteem of women. In a study of mothers of small children who worked either full-time, part-time, or only a few hours a week, Ann Wells found that the highest levels of self-esteem were reported by women who worked least, and the lowest by those who worked most. This, despite the fact that all women enjoyed working outside for pay more than they enjoyed working at home. Again, this finding suggests the ambiguous meaning of self-esteem. Full-time professional women with families might have lower self-esteem not because they are accomplishing less, but because they expect more from themselves than they can possibly deliver. These issues bring into focus how arbitrary the division is between work done for pay and the housework women have been traditionally expected to do for their families. As Elise Boulding and other social economists have pointed out, maintenance work might not be productive, but if it had to be paid for as a service, the bill would run close to the GNP. The cost of mothers' nurturance of children, care of the sick, cooking, cleaning, and so forth at the market rate would double the national payroll and perhaps force us to adopt a more humane economy. In the meantime, however, while doing housework may bolster a married woman's self-esteem, it does not contribute much to her emotional well-being. Cooking, shopping, driving the family around, and caring for children are accompanied by only average emotions. But cleaning the house, cleaning the kitchen, doing laundry, fixing things around the house, and balancing the checkbook are generally among the most negative experiences in a woman's day. Work has severe drawbacks, but its lack is worse. The ancient philosophers had much good to say in favor of idleness, but what they had in mind was the idleness of a landowner with many serfs and slaves. When idleness is forced on someone without a handsome income, it just produces a severe drop in self-esteem and general listlessness. As John Hayworth, a psychologist at the University of Manchester, has shown, young men out of work, even when paid relatively generous unemployment compensation, have a very hard time finding satisfaction in their lives. In a compilation of studies involving 170,000 workers in 16 nations, Ronald Inglehart found that 83% of white-collar workers, 77% of manual workers, and only 61% of the unemployed said that they were satisfied with their lives. The Bible suggestion that man was made to enjoy the bounty of creation without having to work for it does not seem to jibe with the facts. Without the goal and the challenges usually provided by a job, only a rare self-discipline can keep the mind focused intensely enough to ensure a meaningful life. The finding through our ESM studies that if one looks at the sources of flow in the lives of adults, one finds more occasions of it on the job than in free time seemed quite surprising at first. The moments when a person is in a high-challenge, high-skill situation, accompanied by feelings of concentration, creativity, and satisfaction, were reported more often at work than at home. After further thought, however, this finding is not that surprising. What often passes unnoticed is that work is much more like a game than most other things we do during the day. It usually has clear goals and rules of performance. It provides feedback either in the form of knowing that one has finished a job well done, in terms of measurable sales, or through an evaluation by one's supervisor. A job usually encourages concentration and prevents distractions. It also allows a variable amount of control, and, at least ideally, its difficulties match the worker's skills. Thus, work tends to have the structure of other intrinsically rewarding activities that provide flow, such as games, sports, music, and art. In comparison, much of the rest of life lacks these elements. When spending time at home with a family, or alone, people often lack a clear purpose, do not know how well they are doing, are distracted, feel that their skills are underutilized, and as a result feel bored, or, more rarely, anxious. So it's no wonder that the quality of experience at work is generally more positive than one would expect. Nevertheless, if we had the chance, we would like to work less. Why is this so? Two major reasons seem to be involved. The first is based on the objective conditions of work. It is true that since time immemorial, those who paid another person's wages were not particularly concerned with the well-being of their employees. It takes extraordinary inner resources to achieve flow while digging a mile below ground in a South African mine, or cutting sugarcane on a sweltering plantation. Even in our enlightened days, with all the emphasis on human resources, management is all too often disinterested in how employees experience work. Therefore, it's not surprising that many workers assume that they cannot count on work to provide the intrinsic rewards in their lives, and that they have to wait until they are out of the factory or office before they can begin to have a good time, even though this turns out not to be true. The second reason is complementary to the first one, but is based less on contemporary reality and more on the historical disrepute of work, which is still transmitted by the culture and learned by each of us as we grow up. There is no question that during the Industrial Revolution of 2.5 centuries ago, factory workers had to labor under inhumane conditions. Free time was so rare that it became one of the most precious of commodities. Workers assumed that if they only had more of it, they would automatically be happier. The trade unions fought heroically to shorten the work week, and their success is one of the bright accomplishments in the history of humankind. Unfortunately, while free time might be a necessary condition for happiness, by itself it is not sufficient to guarantee it. Learning how to use it beneficially turns out to be more difficult than expected. Nor does it seem that more of a good thing is necessarily better. As is true of so many other things, what enriches life in small quantities might impoverish it in larger doses. This is why by mid-century psychiatrists and sociologists were putting up warning signals to the effect that too much free time was threatening to become a social disaster. Both of these reasons, the objective work environments and the subjective attitudes we learn toward them, conspire to make it difficult for many persons to admit, even to themselves, that work can be enjoyable. Yet when approached without too many cultural prejudices, and with a determination to shape it so as to make it personally meaningful, even the most mundane job can enhance the quality of life, rather than detract from it. But of course the intrinsic rewards of work are easiest to see in the highly individualized professions, where a person is free to choose his or her goals and set the difficulty of the task. Highly productive and creative artists, entrepreneurs, statesmen, and scientists tend to experience their jobs like our hunting ancestors did theirs, as completely integrated with the rest of their lives. One of the most common tropes in the nearly 100 interviews I conducted with such persons, as Nobel Prize winners and other creative leaders in different fields, was, "You could say that I worked every minute of my life, or you could say with equal justice that I never worked a day." The historian John Hope Franklin expressed this blending of work and leisure most concisely when he said, "I have always subscribed to the expression, 'Thank God it's Friday,' because to me, Friday means I can work for the next 2 days without interruptions." For such individuals, flow is a constant part of their professional activity. Even though operating at the edges of knowledge must necessarily include much hardship and inner turmoil, the joy of extending the mind's reach into new territories is the most obvious feature of their lives, even past the age when most people are usually content to retire. The inventor Jacob Rabinow, with over 200 patents to his name, describes his work at age 83. He says, "You have to be willing to pull the ideas, because you're interested. People like myself like to do it. It's fun to come up with an idea, and if nobody wants it, I don't give a damn. It's just fun to come up with something strange and different." Ed Asner of Lou Grant fame was still looking for new challenges to his acting skills at age 63. He said, "I thirst to burst at the seams, eager for the chase." The double Nobel laureate Linus Pauling, interviewed when he was 89, said, "I don't think I ever sat down and asked myself, now what am I going to do in life? I just went ahead doing what I like to do." The eminent psychologist Donald Campbell advised young scholars, "Don't go into science if you are interested in money. Don't go into science if you will not enjoy it, even if you do not become famous. Let fame be something that you accept graciously if you get it, but make sure that it is a career that you can enjoy." And Mark Strand, former poet laureate of the United States, describes flow well in the pursuit of his vocation. He said, "You're right in the work. You lose your sense of time. You're completely enraptured. You're completely caught up in what you are doing. When you are working on something and you are working well, you have the feeling that there's no other way of saying what you're saying." Of course, people like these are very fortunate in having attained the pinnacle of glamorous professions. But it would also be easy to find a great number of famous and successful people who hate their jobs, whereas one can find businessmen, plumbers, ranchers, and even assembly line workers who love their work and describe it in lyrical terms. It is not the external conditions that determine how much work will contribute to the excellence of one's life. It is how one works and what experiences one is able to derive from confronting its challenges. No matter how satisfying, work alone cannot make life complete. Most creative individuals we interviewed said that their families were more important to them than their careers, even though their actual habits often belied these sentiments. Stable, emotionally rewarding marriages were the norm among them. When asked what accomplishments in life they were most proud of, one of the most typical responses echoed that of the physicist Freeman Dyson. He told us, "I suppose it is just to have raised 6 kids and brought them up, as far as one can see, all to be interesting people. I think that's what I am most proud of, really." John Reed, CEO of Citicorp, claimed that the best investment he ever made was the year he took off from his successful career to spend with his children as they were growing up. He said, "Raising kids is far more rewarding than earning money for a company, in terms of a sense of satisfaction." And most such individuals fill whatever free time they have with interesting leisure activities, from playing public concerti to collecting rare nautical maps, from taking up cooking and cookbook writing to volunteering to teach in underdeveloped countries. Thus, love and dedication to one's calling doesn't have to have the negative connotations of workaholism, and that term could legitimately be applied to a person who is so immersed in work as to give up other goals and responsibilities. A workaholic runs the risk of seeing only the challenges related to his job and learning only the skills appropriate to it. He is unable to experience flow in any other activity. Such a person misses a great deal of the opportunities that contribute to the excellence of life, and often ends life miserably when, after an all-consuming addiction to work, he is left with nothing he can do. Fortunately, there are many examples of persons who, although dedicated to their work, have more multifaceted lives.